Joining me now is NBC News senior national security and intelligence analyst and former director of the CIA, John Brennan. Director Brennan, thanks for being on.
Good morning, Hallie.
Plenty to talk about as usual. So what do you make of this idea that this could be an October surprise doc dump?
I have no idea whether or not something like that is planned or anticipated, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are going to be other efforts to try to undermine the Mueller investigation, as I think we have seen Mr. Trump and others trying to do that just repeatedly over the last year or so. So do they have something planned? They might. I don't know.
He thinks, the president seems to think it is going to be exactly that, because he says these documents will expose, quote, really bad things at the FBI. Devin Nunes said in Politico, you're going to be frightened by what you see. What could they be talking about? Really?
I don't know. I am all for transparency as far as making sure that we have good government and good government officials who are carrying out their responsibilities. But I'm also very concerned, like Jim Comey is, about exposing intelligence sources and methods, as well as doing anything that might compromise an ongoing criminal investigation. And it seems as though the White House and the Republicans are being very selective in terms of what it is that they put out.
Well, explain that, because there is a push-pull here, right? You have said that the FBI and other officials do have an obligation to push back on this, but the president is allowed to declassify materials. He does have that authority. So how do you square that?
Well, the president has the authority to do a lot of things. Doesn't mean if he does it, it's the right thing to do, such as going to war, pushing a button that is going to launch missiles. So I really hope that the officials in positions of authority and with access to Mr. Trump are going to explain to him in a very calm and rational manner what the real adverse impact would be on intelligence capabilities or criminal investigations or whatever. Whether or not Mr. Trump chooses to accept their counsel is something else. But I do think it is the responsibility of those officials who understand just how delicate and sensitive these capabilities are.
So there's two questions then on that. And you understand this process of declassification and how that works and what is important and what is not when it comes to redactions, for example. So when there is this review process in place right now, the FBI, the DOJ, looking at what to declassify in these documents, is that legitimate? Is that a stalling tactic? Could it be both?
Well, anytime there's going to be a directive or an interest in trying to release something, the relevant agencies will go through a process of reviewing the information and looking at what the negative impact would be, either on law enforcement or national security or intelligence, of releasing some information. And they should, in fact, try to push out as much information as possible.
In the interest of transparency.
Right.
Yeah.
And they shouldn't hold anything back because it might be embarrassing or because it's is something that they just don't want to share publicly. There needs to be a basis to redact information and keep it from the public, particularly if a president of the United States directs them to do it. They have a responsibility to try to meet that directive, but if that directive does not take into account the very serious and grave impact on national security, I do think these officials have the obligation to push back against it.
They have already done this review process and released some of this based on this FOIA that was filed by the New York Times and other outlets. The documents are out with redaction, so they've done this review. There is a possibility now that when the president says review this information, some of it will still be redacted, right? The president could just release all of it. What is the fear? What is the danger or the concern if that ends up happening?
Well, I don't know what all is still covered up in terms of the information that is being protected. And I don't know what...
Meaning, is that names, is that incidents and anecdotes?
Whatever else.
Yeah.
But as Jim Comey says, is this going to be something that is going to inhibit individuals from cooperating with law enforcement or intelligence in the future out of fear that their identity, their name, their information that they share in a very confidential way, and sometimes it could be with adverse impact if they are serving overseas or if they are, foreign citizens. If this is going to be exposed, I think that a lot of individuals who might want to work with the U.S. government are going to think twice and three times about it if a president of the United States can just capriciously, arbitrarily, unilaterally, and recklessly release that information.
Director, real quick, last time you were on the show, we talked about your security clearance getting stripped. You said you hadn't heard from anybody at the administration on that.
That's still the same case.
Still the same.
I haven't heard anything, haven't received any notification or phone call or anything about that. So what the actual status of it is, I'm not sure.
White House has said you don't need to be notified. They're just doing it.
Well, yes, but there are certain steps that would need to be taken also in terms of adjustments made to intelligence community databases and whatever.
Okay. Director John Brennan, thank you for coming on.
Thanks, Hallie.
I appreciate it. Thank you for checking out our YouTube channel. why don't you subscribe? It's really easy. Just click on that button down there. And for more news from MSNBC, click on any of these videos here for the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more videos from MSNBC with our newsletters. Head over to msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up.